Welcome to Discover You, an inspiring podcast exploring cutting-edge solutions to our everyday psychological challenges. We explore complex mental health issues and talk to professionals, experts, and renowned authorities at the forefront of transformative healing. Our mission is to educate and destigmatize, and to ultimately view mental health as a proactive quest for optimized living and equilibrium, rather than mere crisis intervention. Welcome to another episode of Discover You, our podcast exploring innovative and effective solutions to issues in mental and behavioral health. I'm JD Kalmenson, CEO of Montare Behavioral Health, a family of dynamic and comprehensive mental health treatment centers in Southern California. I am so honored and excited to introduce you to our wonderful guest today, Dr. David Fawcett. David Fawcett, PhD, LCSW, is a clinical sexologist working in addictions and mental health for 3 decades. He wrote Lust Men and Meth, a gay man's guide to sex and recovery, and is VP for clinical programming at Seeking Integrity, which provides treatment programs for sex, porn, and chemsex addiction. David produces the podcast Sex, Love, and Addiction, Healing Conversations for Men Who Have Sex with Men, and he produced the award-winning documentary Crystal City. He is on the ITAPs faculty for the Rainbow Advocate and Educator certification program, and he is a highly regarded trainer both in the U.S. and internationally. Welcome, David. So happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. It's delightful to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So to begin with, let's talk about sex addiction in the broader sense. Other than, let's just say, gambling, most of the addictions that people are familiar with are substance-based, are chemical dependency. And here, clinically, I know that they're sometimes referred to as processing disorders. Can you give our audience an understanding of what sex addiction is all about? Maybe, what's the history of how it sort of became a formal diagnosis, and what are the parameters of it?
Sure, you bet. I think for many years, it was assumed that to be an addiction, it had to have a substance involved, like alcohol or cocaine or heroin. And the idea of sex or gambling or porn or even food was considered pretty controversial in terms of calling it an addiction. And as we got better imaging techniques with fMRIs and PET scans and other kinds of imaging tools, we were able to really see that if I take cocaine or if I look at porn, my brain lights up in exactly the same ways. It's just two different methods to manipulate the same brain chemistry. And so it became quite clear that these were very definitely addictive disorders, the behavioral addictions. And so when we use sex in a compulsive way, when we look at porn, when we gamble, when we engage in kleptomania, there's a number, when we overwork, when we do high risk exercise, there's a bunch of different things that basically replicate the fight or flight syndrome, which sets off a lot of adrenaline and dopamine. And it's that chemical rush that is the intensity to which people get addicted with these addictions. Here in the US and Canada, gambling has made it to the DSM. The rest are under study, but I assume in a few years we'll get there. But basically what we're understanding now is that those behaviors basically induce the same kind of chemical flow, particularly dopamine, which is kind of the star of the show, that really induces this euphoria and intensity that people crave.
So my understanding is actually that the dopamine release from sex is analogous to some of the stronger drugs and has an even more powerful release than some of the lighter drugs. Is that something that you've seen?
It's true. Not as high as, say, methamphetamine, but just to put it in perspective, an orgasm, which is the most dopamine we can get from any human experience, short of a substance, right, is twice the normal level. Cocaine is about 3 or 4 times that. Methamphetamine is about 1,300 times that. So it's a huge amount of dopamine release. What we see, and it's kind of apples and oranges based on the brain scans we have to do to get these measurements, but basically porn and sex addiction has the same kind of dopamine release potential as cocaine or cocaine use. So very, very strong. And so really of all the potentially addictive behaviors, the most potent, or the most alluring, if you will, are sex, porn, cocaine, and methamphetamine.
So you're saying it's definitely stronger than gambling addiction from the dopamine release perspective?
Again, I haven't seen those numbers compared. Gambling is extremely potent also.
Right.
They work in the very same way because they create this like endless, just very much like a Facebook feed, that bottomless feed of dopamine or a gambling slot machine thing in Vegas, right? Where you keep looking for the win,
Right.
and our brain kind of starts to expect that and want that. And so they all set that phenomenon up in different or greater degrees of severity. Gambling is quite potent, though. And what we find is that certain individuals seem to be more susceptible to certain kinds of behaviors than others, right? So somebody might be more, and we don't know if this is biological. I'm sure it's a combination of of genetic versus environmental as well. But some people tend to be more drawn toward gambling than porn, but they have that addictive influence nonetheless.
So that is a very interesting point that you just brought up. If we're all sort of chasing this dopamine, it's just fascinating that some find it in this manifestation and others are more vulnerable and prone to finding it in another one. You referenced the DSM in the United States and Canada still doesn't recognize it as being on par with even gambling, let's just say. And given the neuroscience and the clear CAT scans that are able to detect what occurs in the brain, it's mind-boggling that it still hasn't reached that level of recognition. Is there a reason that they're hesitating or vacillating on that?
Well, I'll just remind you, back in 1973, homosexuality was taken out as a mental illness by one vote. Right?
Wow.
So, I mean, things move slowly, and it's a very conservative group. And I think I think it'll just take time. And frankly, a younger panel coming on and making those decisions, they're very traditional. It is under review. And I don't know what the votes are secrets. I don't know how close it got to be included or not. But
So
I think
who votes on this?
There's a panel of members from the American Psychiatric Association that are part of this special panel and they take it very seriously. I don't mean to demean them at all. They're distinguished and they take this very seriously, and they have every good intention.
Right.
But I think sometimes they're overly conservative to the point where it's kind of hurting people, where there's clearly a disorder that we're not able to address really directly in this country.
And it is affecting people because at the moment, to receive treatment for sex addiction, my understanding is that you either have to be diagnosed with a secondary mental health diagnosis that would warrant medical necessity for treatment, or you can privately pay. But as far as insurance goes, they will not cover sex addiction in a primary diagnosis. Is that right?
That's absolutely true. The same
so
with
it does.
pornography.
Yeah, so it does have very practical ramifications and implications for millions of Americans. When people talk about sex addiction, I think there's a big myth out there. And like with eating disorder, everybody who likes to eat jokes around and they say that they have an eating disorder. And the same is true with sex addiction because, there are plenty of people, I think almost all people enjoy it. And that's why there is some gray sort of murky area about what makes it an addiction versus just something that we enjoy, that we like to do very often. So what are the parameters from a clinical perspective when somebody knows that they're not just, let's just say, doing something that they enjoy very often, but that there are ancillary implications that this might be compulsive and an actual addiction?
Right. So we use the same 11 criteria in the DSM that we use for any other addictive disorder for drugs. So there's different 11, but the primary ones that we look at are an inability to control the behavior, a preoccupation to the extent of making choices to engage in that behavior to the exclusion of other important events, whether those are work or family, an inability to stop, an inability to control the behavior. So basically, as these behaviors are becoming more and more out of control, and I agree, I've heard the same talk where people joke about, gee, maybe I'm a sex addict, but to meet a real sex addict, there's such pain involved because there's betrayal and cheating on the part of the spouse, and people really do try to make an effort to stop, and they can't. They're acting out. It's just a really horrible kind of situation for people to be in. So I think, but it's the same criteria for any addiction of just losing control and not being able to control it or manage it in any way whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and probably, as far as stereotypes and as far as the lack of understanding, sex addiction sounds to me like the way alcoholism was 100 years ago, where it was just, people viewed it as a disciplinary issue, as a values issue. And then here today, we obviously know, with the millions of Americans who attend AA meetings and the awareness and the type of widespread understanding that society has, that this is not a willpower issue, but that this is a disorder, and there's something as powerful as an addiction that can make you do really destructive things. I think that we still a bit of ways to go for that level of societal understanding in this domain, in sex addiction.
Highly stigmatized.
Yes.
And people still view it as a moral issue. And certainly there's an aspect of moral incongruity, right? If I'm a sex addict, I do things that aren't in line with my values. That's my addiction kind of pulling me to act out in those ways. So that's one of the healing processes of recovery, is kind of getting myself back into integrity with myself and my behavior. But my moral incongruity didn't cause that behavior, right? As a result of it. And it's not a moral issue to start with. It wasn't a moral lapse. It's an addiction. And so I think that's the clarity that we need to have for people.
Yeah, most definitely. Talking about what leads someone to sex addiction, the causations, the pathways. I know with regards to, let's just say, chemical dependency, at Montare, at Renewal, our organizations, we have an assessment where we've created three general categories that we've seen based on our experiences that have led people to chemical dependency. And the first one is, unresolved trauma and mental health that have not been dealt with therapeutically and psychiatrically, that leave an individual with such acute pain that the mind-altering substance becomes a way to numb and silence that pain. The second category is circumstantial, and we define circumstantial by circumstances really leading to a lot of the acting out, a lot of the dependency, and had life dealt them with a completely different set of circumstances, they may never have ended up becoming an addict, as it were. So the circumstances could be anything ranging from surgery, painkillers finishing, they're already susceptible, they have an addictive personality, but had that not happened, they may never have ended up becoming a full-blown addict. And then lastly, we refer to the third category as the intrinsic addict, which what we mean by that is that there's some sort of a deeper, highly spiritually sensitive personality that they have, which requires a lot of meaning and purpose for them to feel good, for them to feel like the status quo in their life is their equilibrium is there. And when they don't have that, there's a vacuum and there's a void that leaves no rest, and it festers and it pesters. And that's, I think, the most misunderstood category. And I feel like the 12 Steps is the most amazing platform for that category, because it's a real spiritual program that injects a lot of meaning and purpose and gives them the opportunity to live in such a sensitized manner. So many people could lie but come home and eat dinner and look at their family in the face, and they could live with that. But to this category, because of the sort of highly sensitized nature of their psyche, they can't. That doesn't work for them. And I'm just wondering whether you see any parallel with these three categories, the circumstantial addict, unresolved mental health, or the intrinsic. Do you see any parallel between these three and sex addiction as having similar pathways and causations to sex addiction?
I think there are, certainly I see all three of those in there. I think there's some overlap. I'm just now in the literature starting to see aspect, and I love your intrinsic category too, what they're calling highly sensitized individuals, right?
Yes.
People that are kind of highly attuned, highly sensitive, and have that kind of exquisite emotional reactivity, right? That needs fine tuning, if you will. And then they become more, I think, vulnerable to addictive disorders as a way of self-soothing and taking care of that. I think for sex addiction, because of the sexual component, what we see an awful lot of or trauma, and if not outright trauma, certainly adverse childhood experiences, and usually not just one or two, but I'd say probably in excess of 4 or 5 typically. And very often, very, very often, those include some kind of sexual abuse. And so I think, and if not sexual abuse, or very often in conjunction with sexual abuse, there's a family structure that's often very rigid or hierarchical or disconnected, right? So the child really has kind of no safe haven within that family of origin. And I think so people become very independent. People learn very soon that they have to take care of their own needs. They often are sexualized very young. So they learn that sex is not only a currency for validation for themselves, a way to get respect and attention from adults. It's a way of getting validation. It's a way of soothing all kinds of feelings. They often learn how to compartmentalize and drop into fantasy easily as a way to just disconnect. So there's a lot of these patterns that are set in that kind of family of origin early on that kind of feed and grow into this addictive behavior, or at least set the stage for it as an adult. I think unlike substances, because of the potential role of sexual abuse to kind of what we would say kind of skew the the sexual arousal template, it can really impact someone's sexual taste, someone's sexual fantasies as they get older. That can be a real issue for people.
Right.
And so I think that's slightly different maybe than some of the substance issues, although I think it's that kind of trauma base is really typical. The opportunistic piece perhaps is less common because I'm thinking of, the athlete who's injured, who gets hooked on opioid medications or something like that. We don't see that as much with sex addiction, although we do see an awful lot of opportunistic entryways into addiction, finding your father's porn stash, for example, or that just kind of accidental stuff like that can just trigger something that, and I have adults who are, 60 years old who vividly remember those first images they saw, 50 years ago, right? So those things burn into, and that was just kind of a chance encounter. And that kind of set a stage for this development, this whole fantasy life for the rest of their adult lives. And so I think those kind of opportunistic moments kind of sort of fit those circumstantial categories you were speaking of before.
Right. Except I'm wondering, when it comes to the circumstantial addict, you sometimes find folks in their 40s and 50s who've never struggled with any type of chemical dependency, with any type of substance abuse, somehow because of the circumstances, end up finding their way there at such a later advanced stage in life. Do you find any parallel to that in the sex addiction space?
Totally. And it comes in specifically in a lot of the guys I treat who combine amphetamines and sex, right? And so I do a lot of work with men who have sex with men who are now in their 50s or 60s, and they're feeling less attractive, less energetic. They talk about when they walk down the street, nobody really sees them anymore. They feel invisible. They feel kind of unworthy. And so certain drugs like amphetamines fill them with self-confidence. They make them feel sexual. They give them all kinds of energy. And so I'm seeing these guys who were never in any way addictive, who are now hooked on cocaine and methamphetamine and sexually acting out in a way because it's their way of kind of dealing with their fading, youth, I guess, in a very counterproductive way, obviously.
And that leads me to my next question. My understanding of sex addiction is that the dependency is not necessarily about the sex, but around the feelings that surround it, the lead up, the rush of emotions, the chase. And that really makes so much sense based on what you're saying. The validation piece is so powerful because we all crave validation, even if we're not needy about it. It's an existential sort of need because it justifies our existence. And so if somebody's feeling insecure and they're not feeling affirmed, then being lusted after, as it were, or being desired becomes a very sort of tangible way for them to feel validated in the here and the moment.
Absolutely. And we see that all the time, especially when you add computers into it and the kind of pseudo intimacy that, relationships with air quotes can occur, right? If you're talking to someone online or you're paying someone online to kind of act out with you, there's this intimacy that occurs and you get validation from them, but it's all transactional.
Correct.
And even if you're paying someone in person to do that for you, whether it's an escort or in whatever you're doing with them, in every case, people come away feeling just so much emptier, right? It backfires. There's a brief, it's like a sugar high. You get a brief hit of dopamine and then just end up that much lonelier. Same thing with clients that hook up with they've had 400 sex partners. They're the loneliest people in the world because
Right.
they're looking for that connection, but they're looking in the wrong way, right? They're not getting an authentic connection. They're hooking up, but
Right.
it's not going anywhere.
Right. And that's clearly one area or one genre, but let's just say somebody who is addicted to pornography, it would be hard to imagine how that could be a validating experience. It's so what type of affirmation and validation could occur at that front? Is there sort of another category where it's just the dopamine release that drives the dependency?
I think, yeah, maybe slightly different. I think what happens with pornography, there's a certain kind of personality that's drawn to that because when you're looking at pornography, you're in total control. There's no vulnerability, there's no exposure, there's no emotional risk. You don't have to go and meet somebody or share anything about yourself. You're controlling the scene, you're controlling the fantasy, you're controlling everything. And I think that appeals to certain people because there's no emotional risk. They can be in their own world and control the fantasy. And the more they immerse themselves in that, the harder it is to engage back in real life, right? It gets almost detached from real life. And that's one of the skills of recovery. One of the strategies of recovery is to teach people how to really break back into the real world and connect in authentic ways emotionally.
Right. That makes sense. A follow-up question to that would be, is cultivating healthy intimacy a really powerful antidote to the addiction, to the disorder?
I think earlier we talked about some of the, I guess, co-occurring or underlying disorders. I didn't mention, I probably should have, one thing I think probably every sex addict has is an intimacy disorder. I think every addict I've ever worked with just doesn't know how to be intimate. And that may be from their own abuse or just growing up in a dysfunctional family or whatever reason, but they just don't know how to connect in healthy ways. And a lot of their connection is sexual or transactional, and they don't know how to be emotional. And compare that with just how we socialize men in this society, which is not great in terms of emotions. So I think that how to be intimate is just almost non-existent. And so I think, that to cultivate compassion, empathy, intimacy, trust, vulnerability, all those aspects that are kind of alien to guys, at least when they first come into treatment, those are the skills that I think are the key.
And as far as the unresolved mental health or other co-occurring mental health diagnoses, what in your experience have you seen linked most with sex addiction that might be a precipitating sort of diagnosis to the sex addiction, or that makes one more susceptible or vulnerable to sex addiction? Is there any specific mental health diagnosis, whether it's bipolar or attachment disorders? What have you seen in your experience that really, more often than not, end up being linked to a co-occurring sex addiction?
Right. It's a great question. So I think what we try to do is kind of a differential diagnosis, because you can have sexual acting out that looks like sex addiction, but if it's driven by a bipolar manic event, that really isn't an addictive disorder per se. It's driven, now it could be, but we've had many people with sex addiction who are also bipolar, but we have to really kind of do some fine tuning on that and see what's driving it, because you can have people acting out due to their bipolar mania that are not sex addicts. So we have to kind of separate that out. Same thing with obsessive compulsive disorder. People aren't getting the dopamine high from sexual acting out. They're kind of resolving their anxiety with it. So we kind of look, those are a little bit on the side, but trauma, as I mentioned, for sure. The two main ones I would say are anxiety and depression are the ones that we see most often playing out throughout. And I would say, you mentioned attachment disorders as a category. I think that's profound. We see an awful lot of people who are in that quadrant of fearful avoidant. And I think that also goes back to that kind of disrupted family of origin stuff, where people are desperate for connection, like come here, kind of borderline-y, come here. But once people get too close, whoa, go back. I'm feeling overwhelmed and engulfed. So there's this push-pull thing all the time. But I think those attachment issues, but I would say just good old anxiety and depression are the ones that we most
That's
often
very,
see.
very eye-opening, because so many people struggle with anxiety and depression, yet they don't end up becoming addicted to sex. So is there a rhyme and a reason why some are more susceptible to that particular way of medicating themselves and getting rid of those feelings, or looking for a temporary distraction, whereas others would never think of doing that as a way to self-medicate?
I think this is kind of where we're on the edge of what we know, right? I think there's a genetic component to addictive disorders. We know that's true for chemical addiction. I suspect it's probably true for different kind of behavioral addictions as well, different tendencies, even patterns that are passed on from one. A lot of the guys that we work with, when we do a family history, they'll often try to identify and see that usually their father, sometimes their mother, or both were in some ways acting out sexually. So I think sometimes these patterns do persist, and it's learned to some extent. In other cases, people learn from their peers. Going back to that validation thing, their peers acted out. Sometimes, boys will be boys kind of stuff in their fraternities or whatever, and some guys just kind of never grow up after that. They continue that acting out behavior. So I think there's kind of many pathways.
Right.
You're absolutely right. A lot of people have anxiety and depression, but
Right.
not everybody becomes an addict. But I think there are other kind of X factors around the edges there that create that outcome.
Yes, and that is so interesting, because people don't necessarily associate depression, anxiety as, co-occurring disorders that are often coupled with sex addiction. So I think that is very interesting. When people read in the news about sexual predators in any area and domain, a lot of them assume that they're sex addicts. Is that a legitimate assumption, or are the two completely unrelated, and a predator is a predator, and it doesn't have to be an addict, that doesn't have to be an addictive inclination that's fueling and driving that predatory behavior? What are your thoughts on the correlation between the two?
No, it's a great question. I really appreciate it too, because it's, in my experience, those two are very, very different things.
Oh.
We at Seeking Integrity, we treat sex addiction. We work very hard to rule out and keep offenders from coming in. But
Sure.
the offender behavior, the offender is not getting their dopamine from the acting out, the preoccupation in the traditional way, at least, that a sex addict would do that. The offender is getting their dopamine and their other neurochemicals from more power and control, from manipulation. It's more about taking advantage of people, and actually, and worse. And so I think it's a very, very different mindset, and much more, every population has a certain degree of antisocial personality, but there's a much more, the way I kind of distinguish the two in very crude categories, the offending behavior is largely antisocial. The sex addiction population is largely narcissistic. And they're very narcissistic, but in my experience, they're narcissistic, I guess, tendencies, because they're narcissists that can be taught compassion and empathy, which I guess isn't a true narcissist, but they have those self-centered, entitled, it's all about me kind of thing, but they're teachable for the most part. And I think that's the difference. In my opinion, offender is a pretty hardcore and a whole different mindset that doesn't really respond to any of the things we do in terms of treatment for sex addiction.
That's very powerful to know. Yeah, that recovery for sex addiction does not necessarily spell recovery for offenders.
No.
Yeah.
There are people that have both, right? But in my experience, there's primary one or the other.
Right. And even if you do have both, they're two separate issues and diagnoses that have to be dealt with, and that's the point, that they're not they're not one and the same. All right, so we've talked about a lot of components of the addiction. Let's jump into the recovery. What does the recovery look like? I mean, when you look at sex addiction, it seems to be more similar to the eating disorder recovery model, which is to regulate the behavior as opposed to the total abstinence model that you'll find with substance abuse. And that leads me to the age-old debate that you find in a lot of these disorders, eating disorder and in substance abuse. Does one recover, or is one perpetually in a state of recovery? Does one have the option or the ability? Is it possible to truly put it behind you and to now sort of not identify with that at all? Or is it something that will be lurking in the back of one's mind, and you got to constantly be vigilant and really make sure that you never lose sight of that potentiality lurking latent right underneath?
Right. It's a complicated answer.
Sure.
So you're right. With things like with sex, obviously the goal is not to just be abstinent. Like, I'm a recovering alcoholic. I just never have to drink again, right?
Right.
Easy, done. But if as a sex addict, the goal is not to give up sex. The goal is to integrate sex in a healthy way.
Right.
And so that the methodology there is it's what's called a circle plan, which is basically 3 concentric circles. The innermost one defines the behaviors that represent relapse. And the beauty of this, by the way, is that the behaviors that represent relapse are different for every sex addict, right? I might be able to masturbate as part of my recovery, but somebody else might not want to masturbate for 90 days. And these things can change too, by the way, for the first 90 days, because that leads me into other things. And so that's not going to be one of my recovery behaviors initially, at least. Somebody else might be able to look at porn. Somebody else might not. So there's
who determines that? Is that you and your therapist who's going to analyze where the compulsive nature of the behavior begins and where it ends?
Exactly. So it's a collaborative effort. So before somebody goes home from our program, we sit down as a therapist, the client, and oftentimes the therapist at home. And then once that person goes home, they'll bring in a sponsor. And these things are like contracts, right? They can't be just changed willy-nilly because I feel like it one day, but they have to be kind of negotiated. They can be changed, but we encourage people to really not change them often, but it has to be done with some accountability. So if I say, if I've not been masturbating, but I said, gee, I think I can do that safely now. I can't just say I'm going to do that. I got to run that by my sponsor, my therapist. Mm-hmm. And it's a way of identifying different behaviors that may or may not be problematic. So the innermost one is relapse. There's a middle circle I call them like the red, like traffic light stop. The middle circle is not the innermost, but the middle ring is yellow, like caution, right? Slippery slope. Mm-hmm. That might be going on an app like Tinder, or going to dangerous places, or going to a bar, mm-hmm. or meeting somebody, or calling an affair partner, or whatever it is for somebody. Mm-hmm. And then the outermost circle represents behaviors that are other ways of getting dopamine, basically healthy behaviors. Spending time with my family, spending time working out, listening to great music, cooking, doing things with friends. Whatever those might be, playing music. Those are kind of the healthier behaviors. So that's how we kind of distinguish, and it gives us a model to differentiate certain kinds of behaviors, so we can tailor it to different situations for people.
Right. It would seem to me that the pathway and the causation that led somebody to sex addiction, just like the pathway and causation that leads somebody to any type of substance abuse, would be heavily instrumental in determining whether the recovery can be sort of final and absolute, or it's an ongoing journey. Do you feel, or do you see any evidence of that based on the different sort of profiles within sex addiction, that really determines what the recovery looks like?
Yeah, I think so. We're talking about these behaviors, right? Whether it's masturbation or watching porn or whatever. I'm a sex therapist and sex addiction therapist both, and I do a lot of work with what we call the arousal template, which is that mm-hmm. map in our heads of what's erotic, right? Mm-hmm. And we know from addiction that, especially these high intensity dopamine rich addictive fantasies, they lay down these really potent fantasies that are directly connected to our addiction, and they don't go away. They stay in our brains. And at any moment, well into recovery, we could reignite those things, and they're very powerful. They can lead us off the path very quickly. And so some of the strategies we talk about with our clients is kind of how to avoid those hot spots in our brains and redirect our erotic energy into different areas. And that's one of the challenges of recovery, by the way, because for a long time in early recovery, people lose sexual interest because there's nothing that matches that intensity of that dopamine rush that they used to get from porn or acting out or any of that. Just their wives or their partners or just normal life doesn't do it. And now that comes back, but it's an adjustment, and they have to kind of really retrain themselves and redirect their erotic energy, if you will.
It's so interesting. You talked about the arousal template, and I'm sure that's something so nuanced and detailed that it might be out of the scope of our discussion. But in a nutshell, does that have a lot to do with an individual's experiences Does that help shape and form that? Or is there a lot of subliminal, subconscious, Freudian sort of influences in that arena of what makes somebody get aroused by this and somebody else get aroused by that?
Again, it's really complicated. It can be, some of it's genetic, like sexual orientation, for example, and other kinds of aspects. Some of it is cultural, with fashion trends and what the church says morally and laws and things like that, TV shows, things like that, culturally. And so there's many different factors, and a lot of it is experiential. And so, and including negative experiences. So if I am sexually assaulted, that's going to affect my arousal template, for better or for worse, right?
Wow.
We see that as an impact of children that are sexually assaulted. Their arousal template is permanently damaged, and that will affect their sexual tastes and sexual self-image, if nothing else, for the rest of their lives.
And even if they treat them, if they get treatment for trauma and they successfully undergo trauma treatment, you said the word permanent, and that's very definitive. So that's something that might never change.
I think what the treatment can do, and I do trauma treatment myself, I think what it can do is help people learn to live with that, in some way do workarounds, in some way do some resolution, so they're not triggered every time certain things happen. And so they're, happier people are kind of at peace with themselves. But from an arousal template point of view, from a sexual point of view, those aspects are pretty much there. And I think we have to kind of learn to work around them. For example, somebody who's been assaulted early on might have that kind of, what I guess Freud would call repetition compulsion, right? They keep doing that over the course of their lives. And I think with trauma therapy, we can interrupt that cycle and help people understand that and not do that. But the impulse to may still be there, and some of that damage may always be there, but they may not have to react to it in a harmful way or a self-harmful way.
So interesting. So even with decades of, let's say, alternative patterns being created in the brain, with the arousal template is sort of really etched in, and it's fixed. It's here to stay.
That's pretty much what our research shows. That it just, those things are there, and they can't really be taken out.
That makes sense. And you mentioned that it would be impossible to remove something from the arousal template, but can new, healthier alternatives be added?
That's the beauty here. The way our arousal template gets kind of, and this is not my word, some of the literature talks about being perverted, is through neuroplasticity, right? The brain is constantly changing. Wherever we turn our attention, the brain kind of goes with us and tries to help us out. And so these experiences, these life experiences, the kind of porn we look at, the kind of things that happen to us, all that goes into our arousal template and starts to inform our erotic fantasies, for better or for worse. In much the same way in recovery, we can start to retrain our erotic focus toward healthier things. So part of the recovery strategy for the folks I work with is really looking at intimacy skills and what is healthy sexuality. And most of us don't know what that is, right? And so we're starting to look at that and understand things, sex therapy techniques like sensate focus, which is a touch exercise, an intimate touch exercise. There's ways of kind of rewiring that part of the brain in a healthier way. So we're not stuck with that. We can use that concept of neuroplasticity. The brain is always changing to teach it new things. And kind of leave the old stuff behind.
That makes so much sense. Being that this is not DSM recognized as of yet in the United States and Canada, so the interventions and the treatments are probably not as standardized. But what would you say, in your experience, are the gold standards of treatment? Obviously, every individual is a unique composite with myriads of really unique details that go into what led them here and what their treatment should look like. But as a whole, if you had to generalize, what are the most powerful and effective interventions that you have found in your experience?
I think there's a couple. I think just in terms of modalities, group is an incredibly powerful force. Just that group modality of other guys, and by the way, gender-based groups of men, groups of women are the most effective. That group process, we do timelines like life stories where people pull it all together, or it's a big project, doing times of their life history, their sexual events, their substance use, their major, acting out, and kind of put all the patterns together. We do impact letters from spouses who in their read-in group about for example, how my husband's sex addiction impacted me. These are incredibly painful letters of betrayal, and they're read in group. And all the guys say, these are things I've heard before, but suddenly in the context of a group where they're kind of a little more vulnerable and open, it's the pathway toward compassion and empathy. It starts to open it up a bit. So those letters, and I think ultimately ongoing care, this is not a quick fix. I would also say really, because I really believe trauma, or at least traumatic adverse experiences underlie a lot of this, that really has to be addressed at some point. And I think to do that too soon, because I view addiction as someone's primary coping mechanism, right? And if we take that away and then start doing trauma work too soon, we can really upset them. I've seen people relapse from some well-meaning therapists starting trauma work way too early before the person had the ability to regulate themselves. So, but trauma work at some point. And then in sex addiction, very important if you want to heal your relationship, there's something called the formal disclosure process. When this involves the addict as a therapist, the spouse as a therapist. It's a formal, basically clearing this is what happened, the whole thing out on the table once and for all. And it's a very formal process that involves a lot of back and forth and trust. And it's the whole point of that is to clear the air and start over. And it's like a baseline for healing. And if a couple intends to go forward and heal, that's a really critical benchmark for them to do.
That's interesting because you don't find that formal disclosure being as vital in other areas of recovery, like chemical dependency and gambling.
I think because of the nature of sex addiction, it's just so personal,
right,
and
secretive,
such betrayal
and trust,
and trust. I mean, we get guys who have had affair partners in their bed at home,
right,
their wife's bed, and
right,
things like that. That are just such, or sleeping with the wife's sister. Just
right,
these ultimate, just horrible betrayals that
right,
that have to be talked about and clear. And
that's right.
And the thing is, and the addict always think, well, maybe she'll leave me. Well, maybe she will, but at least she has the right to know.
Correct.
And then make her, you can't really decide whether to go forward or not unless everything's out on the table. So,
right.
But you're right. I think because of the nature of sex addiction is so personal in that regard, it's different.
Right. And then you mentioned the word earlier, sponsor, and that's a word that has to do with the 12-step program. 12 steps, everybody knows the 12 steps. It's worldwide, millions of followers. And I know that there is this fellowship also for in the world of sex addiction. Is it as powerful as the 12 steps for drugs and alcohol? Is it different? Is it unique? Or, is it just, the same basic model being applied and integrated in another disorder?
I would say it's pretty much the same basic model. Like other areas, there are different fellowships that have sprung up. And they have slight variations.
Mm-hmm.
The original one was Sexaholics Anonymous, SA, and they actually defined recovery for you as heterosexual monogamy, which was fine for some people, but not for everybody, obviously. Mm-hmm. People that, particularly those who were heterosexual. So, but there's others, SAA, SCA, SCLA, and so on. So there's other kind of fellowships that sometimes they're just more popular in one part of the country than another. Sometimes there's slight variations. Some are more amenable to people that use drugs in addition to sexual acting out. So I always recommend to my clients to kind of go around, see what feels the most comfortable in terms of a fit. But the 12-step programs are certainly an essential aspect of recovery from my point of view. For this disorder.
Sure. So in general, treatment for sex addiction would typically be gender specific, right?
Totally, yes. In my opinion, yes.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense. An interesting question that comes to mind is when you're dealing with a gay population, does that create any type of a different dynamic with the group, or it's just everybody's here for the same reason, to get better, and nobody sort of allows the sexual tension in the room to distract them?
When Dr. Weiss and I were creating Seeking Integrity, I worked mostly with gay men over my career. He's worked mostly with straight men. And when we decided to work together, I said, well, of course, we'll have to have separate groups. And he goes, why? And we went with one combined group, and it's been amazing. And I found it very healing in that, in my experience, the gay guys who were kind of afraid of these straight guys, they're both are demystified for the other, right? They're both become vulnerable, and they relate. They, after the first group, basically they're just guys,
Right.
and they can really learn from each other. I found it to be tremendously healing, and basically a non-issue. And that, you know, once in a while, like in any therapy group, if there's an attraction or something that comes up,
Right.
we deal with it in group, or we
Right.
address it. But it was so much of a non-issue. I was kind of astonished.
That's amazing, because you thought it would be,
Yeah.
but then turned out not to be.
Right. It really was.
Right, right. So now you've done a lot of work with co-occurring drug use and sexual disorders. How does the addition of the drug addiction, the drug component, impact somebody with a proclivity towards sex addiction? Does it get treated as two separate sort of disorders, but obviously they're interconnected, they're intertwined?
So we, and my approach over the years actually has been to really look at them as a single disorder with two different expressions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because the dynamic is the same, it's two different ways of getting dopamine. It's all about that manipulating brain chemistry with just two different avenues to do it. Now the recovery strategies are different, right? One is abstinent, one is that circle plan I mentioned. It's more tailored, but overall it's the same stuff, and it's the same stuff. I do recommend for clients that have both that they engage in two different 12-step fellowships, which sounds a bit tricky, and the danger there is kind of splitting and stuff. But generally, the 12-step programs for drugs and alcohol don't want to hear about sex, and the sex programs don't want to hear about drugs. And so people that use both have no safe space to talk about how those things intersect. And that's been a real problem sometimes. And so like I've created a work group on Tuesday nights that I moderate where people can talk about that. So we're trying to create more safe spaces where people can talk about how those things intersect, because they'll get shut down in most traditional 12-step meetings.
What you're saying is because they're two expressions of the same addiction, so it's difficult for somebody who's suffering from both to go to a 12-step meeting strictly dealing with drugs and to talk about their drug addiction, which is so intimately associated and intertwined with another addiction that they're not allowed to talk about. And the same is at the sexual, at the sex addiction 12-step support group. So that would basically mean that it's very difficult for somebody who struggles with chemsex to end up being recovered from just one without the other. That's probably very rare.
Yeah, I don't even recommend people to try that, because it's extremely rare. And usually if one relapses on one, the other will follow soon behind, right? It's just the two, and I use the term fused in the brain. When you do those things repetitively, and there are neurological reasons for this, but those two things get fused, where they're almost inseparable. One will trigger the other in terms of cues and triggers.
Right.
And so it's almost inescapable, really. And even to the point where I've had meth clients who never had a problem with alcohol saying, well, I can't have a beer with my friends, never had a problem with alcohol, but alcohol will disinhibit their desire to stay away from meth, right, and sex. And so even a meth user, I recommend staying away from all abstinence from all drugs, including alcohol. But so it gets tricky, and in terms of how we start to define this.
Yeah, it makes so much, it's tricky, and it makes sense that you have to really treat them as one and the same. What are the biggest obstacles that you find to sustainable recovery from sex addiction?
I think people have that initial period we spoke of where I don't know if you want to call it a sexual anorexic period, but they have very low sexual desire. They get frustrated, and after usually several months, their sexual desire starts to return, or else they push it, and they don't know how to control it. And when it comes back, it's this urge that they feel they want to go act out on, and it's very difficult to kind of reinitiate any kind of sexual behavior or control the urge when it starts to come alive again.
Here they thought they've recovered because they weren't experiencing any desire.
It was just kind of dormant.
Right? As they and then all of a sudden it hits them out of nowhere, and they don't know what to do with that.
Right. And the other thing, this is true for sex addiction too, but also true for chemsex. In the memory of it, and in our arousal template, dopamine lays down such high intensity fantasies that they're very powerful and they can be very triggered very easily. And so I've had clients see their somebody they used with on the street 6 months later, or get a text from a dealer a year later, or just some single random event can trigger this whole like sweating, kind of craving, shaking urge for the drug and acting out. So the potential for really strong triggers lie everywhere. And I think that's the danger, that people have to be really vigilant for a long time. And that's what is tricky, I think, to do. And the other thing, if I can just say one more thing, with methamphetamine, particularly meth, unlike any other drug, damages the dopamine transport system, which means when it sits on that dopamine receptor, it's neurotoxic. It actually destroys it. And so chronic meth use, you're destroying your dopamine system for distributing it. The good news, it comes back, but it takes up to 24 months to come back. And when you don't have good dopamine transport in your brain, you're depressed, like seriously depressed. Meth users call it Suicide Tuesdays after a weekend of partying. You're impulsive, you're hopeless. And so there's this period of what we call anhedonia for 3 or 4 months where people are just miserable.
Wow.
And it's really hard to get through that because, a day without meth is like nails on the wall kind of thing. And if you're not feeling any improvement whatsoever, I've even had clients in that state say, well, nobody really ever gets sober from meth, And one guy said, and if they do, they obviously didn't know how to use meth in the first place. It's like, just this disbelief that anybody can really do this.
Wow.
So there's that headspace that makes it very hard to sustain the recovery.
That's so challenging.
Yeah.
So David, I know that when it comes to chemical dependency, it's vital for the recovery process that folks leave the comfort of their house or wherever they are and enter into a 24-hour inpatient program to be able to recalibrate and really be receptive to the message of recovery. When it comes to sex addiction, is it the same sort of vital benefit for folks to leave where they are and enter into a program, or can a lot of the lessons and insight and intervention occur online through Zoom meetings and through other outpatient levels of intervention?
In my experience, I think if people could do it at home on a Zoom meeting or by reading a book, they would do it, and they can't, right? I think we have found with sex addiction, people really benefit from that safe container of a safe place where they can get away from their electronics, get out of their home where there's a lot of stormy dynamics with their partners or wives or husbands, and kind of just get away and out of the environment for a while and into a group setting where they can really focus. Also, sex addicts really jumping at their work a lot as a distraction. So just really pulling them out of their lives and focusing on the issue. That's really, I believe, essential. Plus, sex addiction has a little bit of withdrawal also in terms of mood. People get very anxious, very irritable. So that's also kind of useful to help monitor.
David, thank you so much for shedding so much light on this topic that is still, like you just referenced, taboo and stigmatized, but so necessary for so many. And the information that you shared was really enlightening. So thank you very much for joining us today on the Discover You podcast. How can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, you can look at our website, which is seekingintegrity.com. And I also want to point out we have a sister site that has a ton of free resources, free weekly webinars, including the chemsex support group I mentioned. Dr. Rob Weiss does a free sex addiction support group every week. These are weekly groups. That's sexandrelationshiphealing.com. There are groups for professionals, for partners, for sex addicts, all kinds of stuff. Podcasts, a ton of resources, all free. Sexandrelationshiphealing.com and seekingintegrity.com.
Awesome. And thank you, audience, for joining us today as well. I hope you enjoyed today's episode at Discover You. At Montare, we want you to know that you're not alone on your journey. And to find out more about innovative treatment programs, you can find us at Montare, behavioralhealth.com. And you can listen to our Discover You podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Wishing all of you wonderful health and a safe and productive day. See you next time.